Over the past year, I set myself the goal of reading at least 100 books, something I'd come close to, but I never quite managed before. In fact, I exceeded the goal, and as of the time of writing this, I have read 111 books. As such, choosing the best was both more challenging and more easy. Challenging because there was so much to go through, but easy because of the number of great books I was exposed to. Reading everything from YA to classic literature, I enjoyed a variety of books, authors, genres, and styles. I read primarily fantasy, but also lost myself in horror, gothic thrillers, dystopia, and drama. It was a busy year for reading, but many of my highlights came towards the end of the year. From October alone, I chose 4 books, because they had the biggest impression on me. There were many honorable mentions, and there were series I would gladly read again someday, even though they didn't make the list. But we'll cover those later. For now, I want to go over the 10 best books I read this year. Some are newer, while others are decades, if not centuries old. But all, for one reason or another, kept me turning the pages. Before we dive in, I'm Riley and this is Otherworldly Fiction. On this channel, I rant about books, discuss characters and lore, share my bookish opinions, and offer the occasional writing advice. If any of that sounds like your cup of tea, hit the subscribe button. Without further ado, here are the 10 books out of 100 plus which grabbed me. Number 1. We Have Always Lived in the Castle. This book was an unexpected surprise, especially since I wouldn't have read it if my mum hadn't bought it for her Halloween collection. I was instantly entranced by the cover, and the premise was unusual too, as Shirley Jackson's stories often are. I'd read Jackson's writing before. While I'd enjoyed The Haunting of Hill House, it hadn't been one of my favorites, but her short story, The Lottery, assigned to me when I was in the 11th grade, was something I never forgot. As such, I wasn't sure what to expect, whether I'd love the story or simply like it, but I was surprised for the better. The book isn't long, being easily read in an afternoon, but the characters and the dynamics between them are fascinating, and the protagonist gave me serious Wednesday vibes. If you, like me, loved Netflix's Wednesday show, you'll enjoy this, though this book came out well before the TV show. Often, I forgot the central heroine, Mary Cat, was 18 years old, as her behavior is closer to that of a child, pinning objects to trees to keep away bad luck, and describing various poisons to her surviving family members. She's a fascinating character, especially when you learn the plot twist towards the end. A sort of infantilized Wednesday Addams with a childish manner and a potentially psychotic streak, it's hard not to like Mary Cat, even if she is the story's anti-hero. The basic premise of the story is that Mary Cat's whole family has recently died, with the exception of her older sister and an uncle. She lost siblings and parents, a fact she hardly dwells on, and the eccentric family has become ostracized by the surrounding community. Foul play is suspected, but nothing has ever been proven. The remaining members of the family are isolated, only going into town to purchase necessities. They live within a creepy old manor, surrounded by trees, and the murder mystery runs throughout, as we take our time getting to know who's left. If you're looking for an unsettling but quirky gothic read, I can't recommend this book enough, but I don't want to say any more for fear of spoiling anything. Number 2. Rebecca. Rebecca was a book I've had sitting on my TBR for years. I purchased it years ago, and it spent all that time on one of my book piles. I always meant to read it, but somehow it never felt like the right time. I've noted before that I'm a mood reader, and it never fit into any of my fantasy binges or Jane Austen rereads. However, as the month of October rolled around, I decided that it was time. As one of the staples of Gothic literature, Rebecca was a natural fit for the spooky season. With a big old house, a troubled husband, and the shadow cast by a dead woman, it couldn't be spookier. I'd already seen and loved the old black and white film, so I wasn't a stranger to the story, but the story nevertheless managed to grip me, even though I knew how it ended. Plus, the story is even more brutal in the book than it is in Hitchcock's film. When reading the book, I was struck by two things. First, by how loyal the movie had been to the source material, save for a handful of mostly minor changes. And second, by its similarities to Jane Eyre. It wasn't until I did further research that I learned Daphne du Maurier, Rebecca's author, had been a fan of the Brontes, and of Jane Eyre in particular. Being myself a fan of Jane Eyre, it makes sense that I would have loved Rebecca. Both stories have an inexperienced young woman from a lower class background, a large home, a brooding husband, and a sense that something is about to go wrong. Like Jane, the heroine of Rebecca is almost made to compete with her husband's first wife. In this case, Rebecca isn't locked in an attic. She's already dead, but her presence is nevertheless felt by the protagonist, to the degree that her happiness is threatened. Plus, her husband, Maxim de Winter, is like Rochester, in that he conceals a checkered past, especially as it regards his treatment of his wife. If you're looking for a twisting mystery, a Gothic classic, or you love Jane Eyre, I highly recommend this book. The characters are well developed. The sprawling Manderley is as atmospheric as Thornfield, and the plot itself, couched between beautiful prose and an engaging cast, is clever and dark. Number 3, The Bloody Chamber. Continuing with the books I fell in love with in October, we come to Angela Carter's collection of short stories, The Bloody Chamber. My first exposure to this book began with a cult classic film, In the Company of Wolves. While not seen within the mainstream, In the Company of Wolves nevertheless had an impact, especially among fans of fantasy, horror, and werewolves. Though easy to overlook, In the Company of Wolves makes the top lists of werewolf films for its gruesome transformations and fantastical imagery. Ultimately a feminist story, exploring the savagery of men, the power women hold, and the beast within all of us, the film was inspired by one story within the collection. Typically, I don't read short stories, but Angela Carter is one of those authors I was willing to make an exception for. In fact, having already bought some of her other work, including both other short stories and novels, what I read made me eager to explore her writing further. In many ways, Angela Carter reminded me of Anne Rice, at least as far as her writing style goes. Neither author is afraid to shy away from disturbing or graphic content, but both writers frame their bloody stories in lush descriptions. Such a writing style won't be for everyone, and some might find both Carter and Rice to be guilty of purple prose. But I, like many other readers, personally enjoy such a style. Carter's prose is immersive. The mental pictures she makes are vivid, something even some of my favorite authors have struggled with. Admittedly, there were some words even I didn't know, and I consider my vocabulary pretty extensive. But overall, I loved her approach. Plus, as far as the stories themselves go, each is based on a classic fairy tale. If you're someone who enjoys dark fairy tale retellings without any of Disney's sugarcoating, but with new twists, then this collection is a must, especially if you're looking for something to read next October or enjoyed the work of Anne Rice. Number 4, Juniper and Thorn. Having finished Angela Carter's collection of dark fairy tale retellings, it was only natural to continue with another dark fairy tale retelling that has readers divided. Juniper and Thorn, penned by Ava Reid, has been called the most controversial book on BookTok, and it's not hard to understand why. In my opinion, this book is for a very specific reader. For someone who enjoyed The Cruel Prince, but who also loved Anne Rice. Compared to the works of Anne Rice or Stephen King, I wouldn't call this the most unsettling story. Seasoned horror fans will have read worse. That said, this book is being marketed towards BookTok's younger demographic, including teens who are used to Holly Black and Cassandra Clare. So the response to the story is understandable. Those familiar with horror might not find the book as scary, while those coming from a YA background might find it disgusting. But for me, as someone who can both appreciate a YA style and the disturbing if pretty stories of Anne Rice, the book was spot on. As I've said, it takes a very specific reader to embrace this book. Someone who enjoys a lighter prose style, with a female heroine and a romantic subplot, but who can also stomach murder, blood, and taboo topics like sexual abuse. This was one of those books I wanted to love before I read it, and I wasn't disappointed. Even the negative reviews only increased my interest in the story, and I loved all of the plot twists. As with We Have Always Lived in the Castle, you have a string of unsolved murders. As with Shirley Jackson's book, I started to have my suspicions about who the murderer was, but I'll say no more, because even for those who have read the book, who is actually responsible for the deaths isn't cut and dry. And even as someone who hasn't read the original fairy tale, I was hooked. Number 5, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. As with Rebecca, I had a collection of Bronte books that have been sitting on my physical TBR pile for years. Having completed my challenge of reading 100 books, there was nothing to do but explore my backlog of forgotten books, and I wasn't disappointed. As I've noted before, I loved Jane Eyre. However, the book that gripped me came from one of the sisters I hadn't yet read. While Jane Eyre was written by Charlotte Bronte, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was written by Anne Bronte, the most overlooked of the 3 writing sisters. Interestingly, Anne's sisters urged her not to publish the book, as they found it controversial. This urging came, of course, from sisters who had written about the abuse of Heathcliff and mad wives being locked up in attics, to say nothing of Rochester's attempts at bigamy and Catherine's turbulent behavior. As a modern reader, I didn't find the story that much more shocking than Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre. But in the time it was written, Tenant of Wildfell Hall was more shocking because, instead of focusing on dramatic but fictional twists, it focused on brutal truths. The tenant, in this case, is a woman who is forced to flee an abusive marriage, something women just didn't do in those days. In the 1800s, women were expected to endure and never complain. They were to place their husbands before themselves, and do only what would better and improve the lives of their spouses. Even if a husband was abusive, at least psychologically or emotionally, there was little a wife could do. Unless he hit her, a husband could more or less do as he pleased, a point Anne wanted to illustrate with her novel. In short, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is a feminist novel, written in a time when feminism was still frowned upon. Divorce was still scandalous, and had to have the approval of the husband. Otherwise, the wife would be accused of deserting her husband, and dragged back like a child if she was found. It was gripping as a story too, and modern readers will feel for the novel's heroine. But Anne Bronte didn't hold back. Nothing is left to the imagination when it comes to the behavior of the heroine's husband and his friends. Awful to not only his wife, but to those same friends, the husband commits every slight he can, short of striking his wife. From being rude to actually committing adultery, this man is horrible. But in the 1800s, our heroine had no recourse, short of leaving all her money with her husband and going into hiding, even changing her name so as not to be found. The book was repressed by the other sisters, following Anne's death. A shame, since this helped to contribute to Anne being forgotten in later years. But I hope more appreciation can be found for what should be a feminist classic. There are no ghosts or moody moors in this book, and no grandiose plot twists. But this is nevertheless a solid story, which makes as great a point as any Dickens novel might. Number 6. The Witching Hour Trilogy. Having noted my love of Anne Rice, it should come as no surprise that some of her books would be included here. The Witching Hour Trilogy has stayed in my mind like few other books. Of course, they aren't for the squeamish. Even if you've read the first 3 books in the Vampire Chronicles, this trilogy, especially the first book, is as messed up as any book can be. If you are someone who was disturbed by Juniper and Thorn, don't read these, because they're 10 times as nasty. Covering topics like incest, rape, and underage affairs, they're not always pleasant reads, especially coming from someone like Anne Rice, whose prose is always descriptive. Though the focus of the books is paranormal, centering on a family of mostly female witches who try to control a ghost who has affected their fortunes over the century, the horror comes as much from the psychological as the supernatural. This is a family with more than one skeleton in its closet, and one of the protagonists, Rowan, is brought back into the fold when she is named following the death of her adoptive parents and biological mother, as the main beneficiary of the family's fortunes. What I loved about these books, and the first novel especially, was their richness. Rice doesn't omit any detail. Throughout the story, we are given glimpses into the past, working from the witch trials to the present day. Anne Rice details each generation, covering multiple time periods and the endless tragedies which struck the powerful Mayfair clan. A feat which would be boring in the hands of any other author, but which Rice executes almost flawlessly. Each character is fleshed out to an exacting degree, including those who are no longer alive. As with Game of Thrones, the characters we develop attachments to are hardly squeaky clean, and the line between who is a hero and who is a villain is continually blurred. Easily the most contentious character in the series is the late Uncle Julian, the only male witch in the family. Though often acting as a support character, many of Julian's acts are reprehensible, perhaps unforgivably so, making the reader unsure as to whether they should be fond of him or disgusted by him. My final reaction would be horrified fascination, because while Julian and many of the other members of the family do terrible things, they're nevertheless interesting. This is to say nothing of the world building throughout the saga. If the family and its members are fleshed out with backstories and emotions explored in depth, the same must be said for the fantasy-oriented aspects of the plot. To start, you have the history of the family's ghost. His story, and the story of the people he came from, is as distinct and detailed as that of the family he's attached himself to. I don't want to give anything away, but Anne Rice was always brilliant about building on her stories, and peeling back new layers when you thought there was nothing more to learn. Once you learn the story behind point A, you'll realize that that story has a story behind it, and that that story has a story behind it, and so on. Everything has a history, and those histories have histories. The story won't go where you'd expect, but that's part of Rice's charm. Her books are never predictable, and if you're someone who's tired of books being sugar-coated and are looking for horror that's entirely unadulterated, then you should read these. They're not for the faint of heart, as Rice holds nothing back, even making Stephen King look innocent. But when I've forgotten other books, I won't forget these. Number 7, The MBor Saga. After years of hearing about Brandon Sanderson, I took the plunge into his work. Taking a gamble, I purchased the whole of his MBor Saga and several of his standalones, without having read a single one of his books. But I wasn't disappointed. Currently, I haven't yet dived into the Stormlight archives, but I started with Sanderson's other biggest series, the MBor Saga. Divided into 2 sub-series and a part of his greater Cosmere universe, the books stood on their own, and what struck me the most was Sanderson's magic system. I've read a lot of fantasy series, but the sheer originality and depth of the magic Sanderson has created is on a level I've never seen. His storytelling overall is great, featuring big thematic questions, fleshed out characters, witty banter, and the usual slew of fantasy races and villains. But it was a treat to read about allomancy, and the magic systems like fearochemy, which related to and complemented it, while still following their own rules. It's not many writers who would create not one, but several complex magic systems within the same world. But Sanderson does so, and in the later series, he even presents us with heroes who combine 2 of the systems, so as to form something that's unique again. All of Sanderson's Cosmere books feature unique magic systems, with his use of color as a magic system being particularly notable in Warbreaker. But his magic systems relating to metal are the most developed, allowing for continual expansion and no shortage of clever plot twists in relation to their use. I keep going on about the magic system, but everything about these books is strong. Characters have differing opinions, beliefs, and religions. They agree and disagree, but manage to come together in the end. Viewpoints shift over time. Characters change and grow, and plenty have internal conflicts as they start to question everything they thought they knew, their core selves being challenged. Vin is a badass female heroine, but her role isn't what readers will initially assume. Other characters, like Sazid, are easy to overlook, but are packed with internal debates and conflict. Though Brandon Sanderson uses the familiar tropes within the MBor Saga, he's careful to subvert them. You have the defeat of the big bad. But then a new question is raised, asking if he should have been killed, and if, unpleasant as he was, his existence wasn't preventing something worse. Diving into classic ideas like the evil monarch, the oppressed underclass, and the chosen one, Sanderson challenges these old tropes, exploring their ramifications and the assumptions readers and protagonists alike make about them and what they actually mean. I still have to read the last book, The Lost Metal, the 4th story in the Wax and Wane cycle, and the 7th of the Mistborn books overall. But I'm eager to do so, as Sanderson's twists never fail to surprise me, or his characters to engage me, with Wayne being another favorite of mine. Number 8. Elantris. Another highlight for me within the Cosmere was Elantris. While other readers have said it's one of the weakest books in the Cosmere, being Sanderson's debut novel, it was still one of my favorites, featuring another unique magic system, fleshed out characters, and more big questions, including those related to religion and the Chosen One. It's still a powerful novel on its own, only overshadowed by the author's other works. What I loved about the novel was how bleak it was. The story of a fallen civilization brought to ruin, it had an icky feel. Elantris, once a great and beautiful city, is now a disgusting wasteland, its slimy streets blocked off from the rest of society. But that's not the darkest part of the story. The horror of the novel comes in what befalls the Atlantrians themselves. Instead of having one chosen one, we have a whole race of them. Once ordinary people themselves, the Atlantrians are chosen seemingly at random from high and low from among humankind. However, being the chosen one in this case isn't a good thing. With the death of their magic, the Atlantrians no longer have power. Though immortal, those who remain, and those who are still chosen, are doomed to a life of internal suffering. shut away on being turned within Elantris, and forbidden from leaving, they are essentially treated like lepers. Once someone becomes an Atlantrian, they slowly go mad over time as a result of the pain. If you stub your toe, that pain lasts forever, as if you are stubbing it again for the first time. Every injury is permanent, and felt continually in full force, and hunger is constant too. Starvation doesn't kill, but it builds, and little to no food is delivered through the gates. All in all, the novel has a hopeless feel. All of Sanderson's novels have a dark undertone, but Elantris is easily the most depressing, and I loved it for that. It's just gritty. Elantris itself is a hellhole. The streets are piled in muck, and its residents have either given up or become bandits. In reading the novel, the tone most reminded me of Stephen King's fairy tale. Elantris is the closest Sanderson has come to writing a horror novel, though the author is good about injecting the story with hope too, even when all seems lost. Number 9. A Court of Silver Flames. Out of all the ACOTAR books, A Court of Silver Flames is easily one of the most controversial. For many readers, this book was a turning point for them, either cementing their love for the series or making them lose interest entirely. Though I loved the book, I can see why it didn't gel with everyone. For a start, the book follows the perspective of Feyre's oldest sister, Nesta. Perspective shifts are never easy on readers, but Nesta, throughout the books, is easily one of the least likable characters. Bitter, rude, and hostile towards Feyre, it was hard to find any redeeming qualities in her. Plus, there's the fact she sat at home while leaving her littlest sister to do all the hunting. In this sense, she was neglectful to everyone's beloved heroine. But A Court of Silver Flames reveals the extent of Nesta's suffering, as well as the drastic measures she nearly had to take to keep the family alive. The second point of contention for some readers will come in the lack of plot. Though there is a plot, it takes a back seat to the relationships, both the friendships and the romance, and Nesta herself, who is on a journey of recovery from grief and addiction. There is an evil queen and 3 MacGuffins Nesta must retrieve. But this plot, which would be the focus in another fantasy story, really is treated as a subplot, which I personally didn't mind. In choosing to make the book about the characters first, while treating the plot as the dressing, Sarah J. Maas took a creative risk, but I loved it. As someone who prefers character-driven stories, I loved that the majority of time was just spent on getting to know Nesta, and watching her work through her various struggles, her fractured connection to her family, her inability to get close to anybody, and of course her romance with Cassian. Writing a story where the plot was secondary, Maas lost some readers, but I appreciate her attempts to do something different. And in a world where stories are expected to be increasingly fast-paced and action-oriented, it was a breath of fresh air. Also, I always enjoy a good anti-hero. The characters that are most interesting to me are the ones who are rough around the edges. Nesta is cutting and cold, but she's also lonely and affected, like Feyre, by the many traumas of her past. Though she could have been a better sister, she endured her own share of suffering, and there's still a chance for her to be the sister she should have been. In learning to open up to others, developing friendships, entering into a romance, and helping to save Feyre's life, she finally finds her place, and I love that. Seeing a jaded and disliked character change and become a stronger person is always good to see, and I thought Maas handled it well, especially in reinventing what fantasy novels could be. Number 10. The Tale of the Body Thief. This list wouldn't be complete without another shout out to Anne Rice. Though I've long been a fan of Rice's work, I've only, until this year, read the first 3 books in the Vampire Chronicles. Of course, I've read them multiple times, but that didn't change the fact that there were more than 10 books within the whole saga. All of the books ranged from incredible to so-so, but out of all of them, my personal favorite after the first 3 was The Tale of the Body Thief. Rice's books go to some strange places, but Body Thief featured an especially novel idea, that of people literally switching bodies. We've seen this concept before, with movies like Freaky Friday, but Rice explores what happens when a vampire makes the switch. Lestat mourns his lost humanity. However, on being placed again in a human body, he mourns his lost immortality even more. Even the act of going to the washroom is disgusting to him, as it's something he hasn't had to do for centuries. Accustomed to incredible eyesight, super strength and speed, and the idea that he'll live forever, Lestat hates being human. In a comparatively clumsy human body, he feels weak and helpless. Having taken his immortality for granted, he's horrified by the revelation that he could actually die, as the soul he made the switch with has absconded with his vampire body and is now wreaking havoc under a false identity. What follows is an adventure to get his body back, one that's surprisingly exciting and fast-paced for a Rice novel. Tracking the thief to a boat, Lestat must then hide until he can find the right moment to confront the trickster and force them to reverse the switch. Lestat is always an engaging character, even when he's doing something terrible. But he's also impulsive, a Byronic character who brings the worst on himself with his poorly thought-out choices. Though you feel for him, this latest in his string of disasters is as much his fault as any, and for a time at least, he feels the full consequence of his actions. In learning that he doesn't want to be human again, Lestat learns something new about himself, and about what he actually wants out of life, immortal or otherwise. Whether for its unique premise, the adventure Lestat goes through, or the inner turmoil Lestat endures from the story's beginning to end, this book deserves to be better remembered. Like the first 3 novels in the saga, Tale of the Body Thief was easily one of its highlights. As with many of Rice's novels, it could also be read on its own, as Rice will always tell the reader what they need to know before diving into a story that stands up well on its own. Before we end this video, I have to note the other books that made an impression on me. While they didn't make the list, most of them only earning 4 stars, I nevertheless enjoyed them and wanted to mention them here. First off, we have the Shatter Me series. A solid dystopian story, I enjoyed seeing the growth of the series' protagonist, Juliet, as well as learning her twisted family history. There were some moments where I had to suspend disbelief, including the fact that an insecure teen girl took down a whole government with barely one regiment of soldiers following her. But overall, I loved the premise and Juliet herself. She changes slightly with every book, going from an abused introvert to a powerful superhero. Warner, too, though initially a villain, also undergoes several changes, as we learn that he, like Juliet, was a tool of his parents. I read the series quickly, finding them addicting, and hope to reread them one day. Another overlooked series I had the pleasure of reading was the Golden Compass trilogy. These books were highly original. Moreover, they weren't afraid to hit the reader where it hurt, leaving us with a bittersweet ending when it comes to Lyra and her love interest. The whole concept of the daemons, which represent part of a person's soul, is still one of the most original ideas there is, but Lyra herself and the journey she makes is exciting, sad, incredible, and tragic, all at the same time, as Lyra finds herself and loses herself again in a way that captures the joint tragedy and beauty of growing up. The book also uses powerful prose and raises big questions, including those related to theology, in ways that are startling in a series for younger readers. Despite being middle grade, the Golden Compass trilogy is rich in world building, language, and themes, putting it, in my opinion, on the same level as Harry Potter or Narnia, series known for their maturity and richness. As for more fun reads, I finally had the pleasure of reading Charlene Harris's Southern Vampire Mysteries, better known as True Blood, the books having been adapted into a television show. Out of all the heroines I've encountered, Sookie is easily one of my favorites. Tough but human, flawed but caring, and down to earth even in the face of the impossible, Sookie is easy to relate to and to root for. A waitress who's just trying to make ends meet, Sookie must contend again and again with the supernatural, despite her desire to lead an ordinary life and pay the bills. These stories can be dark, lighthearted, funny, and playful. They're packed with action, romance, mystery, and humor, to say nothing of the fantasy elements or the lore around creatures like vampires, werewolves, and shapeshifters. The cast of characters Sookie must deal with is colorful, and throughout, Sookie has multiple love interests, keeping you guessing to the end who she'll ultimately choose. I'm all the happier that my personal ship won out, but I'm not going to spoil who Sookie picks in the end. Though there's plenty of action, I always appreciate a series that's willing to slow down. Between all the carnage and bloodshed, there are also friendships, baby showers, and family dramas. Elements I actually enjoy in my fantasy novels. I'm not against action, but I always feel closer to the characters when I can see them just living their lives. And Harris is great about balancing all of the plots, be they the action-oriented ones, or those relating to Sookie's relationships with friends, family, and love interests. In reading more than 100 books this year, I was exposed to dozens of great stories in all genres and styles. I discovered new authors, like Daphne du Maurier and Shirley Jackson, which I plan to read more of, along with new favorite books, which I plan to reread someday. I can't possibly talk about all the fantastic books I read this year, even in the honorable mentions, but I had to mention my top 10. Whether they were fantasy, gothic, drama, or classic, all of these books touched me in some way. Most of the books I plan to read in the new year are written by the authors I've discussed here, as I'm eager to explore more of their work. And while I don't know that I'll read 100 books going into 2024, I'm looking forward to discovering more amazing stories. Of course, 2023 wasn't the only year I enjoyed a slew of fantastic stories. If you want to hear what stories I loved in 2022, click the video on the left. And if you want to hear which books I plan to read in the new year, hit the video on the right. Thank you for watching, and happy reading!